The wind howled through the mountain pass like a living thing, carrying with it the scent of snow and the promise of a storm that would bury everything in its path. Nancy Patel pressed her back against the rough bark of a towering pine, her breath coming in sharp, visible puffs as she clutched the small bundle of belongings that represented everything she had left in this world. Her dark eyes, rimmed with exhaustion and grief, scanned the treacherous slope below, where three men on horseback moved with predatory patience, their voices carrying on the bitter air. "She can't have gone far," one of them called out, his words cutting through the wilderness like a blade. "Woman like that, alone up here, she'll freeze before morning if we don't find her first." Nancy's fingers tightened around the worn leather satchel that contained her late husband's last letter, the deed to land she'd never seen, and $17 that stood between her and starvation. The men below were her husband's creditors, vultures who had circled the moment they learned of his death in the mining accident 3 weeks ago. They claimed she owed them money she didn't have, demanded payment in ways that made her skin crawl and her heart race with terror. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her press deeper into the shadows, her body trembling not just from the cold, but from the bone-deep fear that had driven her to flee into these unforgiving mountains. She had nowhere to go, no family to turn to, no friends who would risk harboring a woman marked by debt and desperation. The wilderness that surrounded her was harsh and unforgiving, but it was nothing compared to what waited for her in the settlements below. A branch snapped somewhere to her left, and Nancy's head whipped around, her heart hammering against her ribs. Through the thick stand of evergreens, she caught sight of a figure moving with the fluid grace of someone who belonged in these mountains, someone who knew every rock and tree as intimately as she had once known the cramped rooms of her former life. The man was tall and broad-shouldered, his dark hair touched with silver at the temples, his weathered face bearing the kind of lines that spoke of years spent under an open sky. Gary Ortiz had been tracking the sounds of pursuit for the better part of an hour, his keen eyes reading the signs that city folk left scattered across his mountain like breadcrumbs. He'd built his cabin in this remote corner of the wilderness precisely to avoid the complications that other people brought, the noise and chaos and endless demands that had driven him from civilization after his wife's death 5 years ago. But something about the desperate quality of this particular chase, the way the woman's tracks showed stumbling exhaustion while her pursuers moved with cruel confidence, had stirred something in him that he'd thought was buried as deep as his beloved Elena. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. The woman huddled against the pine tree was younger than he'd expected, perhaps 30, with the kind of delicate features that spoke of a life lived indoors, away from the harsh realities of mountain survival. Her clothes, though well-made, were utterly inadequate for the dropping temperatures, and the way she held herself spoke of someone balanced on the knife's edge between courage and complete collapse. Gary had seen that look before, in the mirror, in the months after Elena's fever had taken her and left him alone with nothing but grief and the echoing silence of their empty home. "Ma'am," he said quietly, his voice pitched low to avoid carrying to the men below, "you're going to freeze to death up here." Nancy's eyes snapped to his face, wide with terror and the kind of desperate calculation that came from having no good choices left. She clutched her belongings tighter, as if they could somehow shield her from whatever new threat this stranger represented. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. "I don't have anything. I can't pay you. I can't give you what they want. I just need to disappear." Gary studied her for a long moment, taking in the exhaustion that made her shoulders sag, the way her hands shook from cold and fear, the proud tilt of her chin that suggested she'd rather die than beg. He'd learned to read people in his years as a trapper and guide, and everything about this woman spoke of someone who'd been pushed past her breaking point, but was still fighting with every breath in her body. "Those men down there," he said, nodding toward the slope where the voices had grown more distant. "They're not mountain men. They'll give up when the storm hits, head back to whatever warm saloon they crawled out of. But you won't last the night up here dressed like that." "I don't have a choice," Nancy replied, her voice gaining strength even as her body betrayed her with violent shawns. "They want to collect on my husband's debts, but not with money. They made it very clear what kind of payment they'd accept, and I'd rather die in these mountains than submit to that. The words hung between them like a challenge, and Gary felt something shift in his chest, a stirring of the protective instincts that had once made him a good husband, a reliable friend, a man who stood between the innocent and those who would prey upon them. He'd spent 5 years telling himself that he was done with other people's problems, that his only responsibility was to his own survival and the memory of the woman he'd loved and lost. But looking at Nancy Patel, seeing the fierce dignity in her dark eyes and the way she held herself ready to fight even when she had nothing left to fight with, he found himself remembering who he used to be. "My name is Gary Ortiz," he said, extending his hand in a gesture that felt rusty from disuse. "I have a cabin about 2 miles from here, well hidden, warm, and stocked for winter. You can stay there until this blows over, until those men give up and head back to whatever hole they crawled out of." Nancy stared at his outstretched hand as if it were a snake that might strike her. "Why would you help me? You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. What do you want in return?" The question was fair, born of hard experience and the kind of cynicism that came from learning that nothing in life was ever truly free. Gary let his hand fall to his side, but he didn't step back, didn't let her retreat further into the shadows where the cold would claim her before morning. "5 years ago, I lost my wife to a fever that took her in 3 days," he said, his voice steady despite the pain that still lived in those words. "Elena was the best person I ever knew, kind and generous and strong in ways that put most men to shame. When she died, I came up here to get away from people, from their pity and their attempts to help, and their expectations that I should move on, should find someone else, should pretend that losing her was just another setback instead of the end of everything that mattered." Nancy's expression softened slightly, recognizing the raw honesty in his words, the way grief could hollow out a person and leave them walking through the world like a ghost. "I've been alone up here for 5 years," Gary continued, "telling myself that I was better off without the complications that other people bring. But seeing you up here, running from men who want to hurt you, it reminds me that Elena would be ashamed of the man I've become. She'd expect me to help, to do what's right, regardless of what it costs me." "And what if I'm not who you think I am?" Nancy asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if I'm a liar, or a thief, or someone who brings nothing but trouble?" Gary considered this, his gray eyes studying her face with the careful attention of a man who'd learned to read the wilderness for signs of danger. "Then I suppose I'll deal with that when it happens. But right now you're a woman alone in the mountains with a storm coming and men hunting you who mean you harm. That's enough for me." The wind picked up, sending snow swirling around them in patterns that spoke of the blizzard building strength beyond the peaks. Nancy looked down at the men below, who were already pulling their coats tighter and casting nervous glances at the darkening sky. She thought of her husband, dead 3 weeks now, and the life they'd planned together that had crumbled to nothing the moment his pickaxe had brought down the mine shaft that killed him and 2 other men. She thought of the debts he'd hidden from her, the promises he'd made to dangerous men, the legacy of fear and obligation he'd left her to navigate alone. "I'm a widow with nothing," she said finally, the words carrying the weight of complete honesty. "No money, no family, no skills that would keep me alive in a place like this. If you're offering help, I'll take it. But I want you to know that I can't repay you. I have nothing to give." Gary nodded, understanding the courage it took to admit such vulnerability to a stranger. "I'm a widower with everything," he replied, gesturing toward the wilderness that stretched around them like a vast, untamed kingdom. "Land, shelter, food, skills, and more loneliness than any man should have to carry. Maybe we can share." The simplicity of the offer, the lack of conditions or expectations, brought tears to Nancy's eyes that she quickly blinked away. She'd been braced for demands, for the kind of bargains that would trade one form of captivity for another. Instead, this mountain man offered her something she'd almost forgotten existed: genuine kindness from someone who expected nothing in return. "Those men will keep looking," she said, glancing down the slope where the voices had grown fainter. "They won't give up easily. My husband owed them $500, and they seem to think I'm responsible for his debts." "Let them look," Gary said, shouldering the pack he'd dropped when he first spotted her. "This mountain has 1,000 hiding places, and I know every one of them. By the time this storm passes, They'll be lucky to find their way back to town with all their fingers and toes intact. He started moving through the trees with the quiet confidence of a man who belonged in the wilderness, and after a moment's hesitation, Nancy followed. The snow was falling harder now, thick flakes that caught in her dark hair and melted against her skin. Her inadequate shoes slipped on the rocky ground, and more than once Gary's steady hand caught her elbow, keeping her upright when exhaustion and cold threatened to send her tumbling down the mountainside. The cabin, when it finally came into view through the swirling snow, was larger than Nancy had expected, built of solid logs and stone, with the kind of craftsmanship that spoke of a man who took pride in his work. Smoke rose from the chimney, and warm yellow light spilled from the windows, creating an oasis of comfort in the harsh wilderness. Gary pushed open the heavy wooden door and gestured for her to enter, and Nancy stepped into warmth that seemed to wrap around her like an embrace. The interior was simple but well-appointed, with handmade furniture that showed the same attention to detail as the cabin's construction. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, and shelves lined the walls, filled with books and tools and the kinds of supplies that spoke of a man who planned for every contingency. But what struck Nancy most was the sense of emptiness that pervaded the space, the feeling that this was a home built for two people but inhabited by only one. "There's a bedroom in the back," Gary said, hanging his coat on a peg by the door. "It was meant to be a nursery, but Elena and I never had children. You can sleep there, and I'll take the couch by the fire. There's food in the pantry, enough to last through any storm these mountains can throw at us." Nancy set down her small bundle of belongings and looked around the cabin with something approaching wonder. After weeks of sleeping in barns and abandoned buildings, of scrounging for scraps and living in constant fear of discovery, the simple comfort of four solid walls and a warm fire seemed almost too good to be true. "Why are you doing this?" she asked again, needing to understand the motivations of this man who'd appeared out of the wilderness like something from a story. Gary was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as if it held answers to questions he'd been asking himself for years. "Because Elena would have done the same thing," he said finally. "Because there's more than enough loneliness in this world without adding to it. And because maybe helping you helps me remember who I used to be before grief made me forget." Outside, the wind howled with increasing fury, and Nancy could hear the voices of her pursuers growing fainter as they retreated in the face of the storm. For the first time in weeks, she felt something approaching safety, a respite from the constant fear that had driven her into these mountains. But safety, she'd learned, was a fragile thing, and trust was a luxury she could barely afford. "Tell me about your husband," Gary said, settling into a chair across from her. "What kind of man leaves his wife to face his debts alone?" The question stung, partly because Nancy had asked herself the same thing countless times in the weeks since his death. "David was a good man," she said carefully, "but he was also a dreamer, always convinced that the next claim, the next investment, the next opportunity would be the one that made us rich. He hid the debts from me, thinking he could pay them off before I ever knew they existed. And when he died, the creditors came calling within a week of the funeral. They had papers, contracts, promises David had made using our home as collateral. When I couldn't pay, they offered me alternative arrangements." Nancy's voice grew quiet, but there was steel in it. "I chose to run instead." Gary nodded, understanding the impossible position she'd been placed in. He'd seen enough of the world to know how it treated women without protection, without resources, without men to stand between them and those who would prey upon their vulnerability. "How long were you married?" he asked. 3 years. We met in Denver, where I was working as a seamstress. David was charming, full of stories about the fortunes to be made in the mining camps, the adventures waiting in the wilderness. I thought I was marrying a man who would show me the world." Nancy's laugh was bitter. "Instead, I married a man who left me with nothing but his debts and his dreams." The storm outside reached its full fury, rattling the windows and sending snow swirling past in patterns that spoke of nature's raw power. Gary rose and added another log to the fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. In the warm light, Nancy could see the careful way he moved, the economy of motion that spoke of years spent alone, of habits formed in solitude and maintained through discipline. "What about you?" she asked. "What brought you to these mountains?" Gary settled back into his chair, his eyes distant with memory. Elena and I lived in Colorado Springs. I was a carpenter. She taught school. We had plans, dreams of our own. A house with a garden, children, a quiet life built on simple pleasures. Then the fever came through town one summer, and she was gone in 3 days. Just like that, everything we'd built, everything we'd planned, reduced to nothing. I'm sorry, Nancy said and mourned it. She recognized the particular quality of his grief, the way it had shaped him and changed him and left him fundamentally different from the man he'd been before loss claimed everything that mattered. I sold the house, sold everything we'd accumulated together, and came up here to get away from the memories. Built this cabin with my own hands, thinking that if I could create something new, something that had never been touched by our shared dreams, I could somehow escape the pain. Did it work? Gary was quiet for a long moment, listening to the storm rage outside. No, he said finally. The pain followed me up here, made itself at home in every corner of this place. But I learned to live with it, to carry it without letting it destroy me completely. And maybe that's enough. Nancy studied his face in the firelight, seeing the lines that grief had carved there, the way solitude had marked him. But she also saw strength, the kind of quiet resilience that came from surviving the unsurvivable and finding a way to keep going. Those men who were chasing you, Gary said, changing the subject, what are their names? What do they look like? If they come back, I need to know what we're dealing with. The leader is a man named Briggs, tall and thin with pale eyes and a scar across his left cheek. The other two are just muscle, hired guns who do whatever he tells them. Briggs owns a saloon in Copper Creek, but he makes most of his money lending to miners and collecting when they can't pay. Gary nodded, filing away the information. He'd heard of men like Briggs, predators who circled the mining camps like vultures, feeding on desperation and dreams gone wrong. They were dangerous not just because of their willingness to use violence, but because they operated in the gray areas where law enforcement was thin and justice was often a matter of who had the most guns. The storm raged through the night, and Nancy slept more deeply than she had in weeks, wrapped in warm blankets in a room that felt safe and protected. She woke to the smell of coffee and bacon, to the sound of Gary moving quietly around the cabin's main room. Through the small window, she could see that the snow had stopped, leaving the world outside transformed into a pristine wilderness of white. "Good morning," Gary said when she emerged from the bedroom, fully dressed but still wrapped in one of the blankets he'd provided. "I hope you slept well." "Better than I have in a long time," Nancy admitted, accepting the cup of coffee he offered her. The warmth spread through her hands and up her arms, and she realized how long it had been since she'd experienced such simple comfort. "The storm will have covered your tracks completely," Gary said, settling at the rough wooden table with his own cup. "And those men from town will have headed back to whatever warm hole they crawled out of. You're safe here for now." "For now," Nancy repeated, tasting the uncertainty in those words. "But they won't give up. $500 is too much money for men like that to simply write off. Then we'll deal with them when they come back. This mountain has ways of dealing with men who don't belong here." There was something in Gary's tone that made Nancy look at him more carefully, seeing past the quiet kindness to the steel underneath. This was a man who'd survived 5 years alone in the wilderness, who'd built a life from nothing in one of the harshest environments on Earth. The gentleness he'd shown her was real, but it was balanced by a strength that spoke of someone who'd learned to protect what mattered to him. "I can't stay here forever," she said. "I won't impose on your kindness indefinitely." "Where would you go?" Gary asked. "You said yourself that you have nothing, no family, no resources. Winter's coming, and these mountains don't forgive mistakes." Nancy was quiet, staring into her coffee as if it might hold answers to questions she'd been avoiding. "I have a deed," she said finally, reaching for the worn leather satchel that contained her few possessions. "David left me land, somewhere called Bear Creek Valley. I thought maybe I could go there, try to make something of it." Gary's expression changed, a flicker of something that might have been surprise crossing his weathered features. "Bear Creek Valley, that's about 50 miles north of here, high country, difficult to reach even in good weather." "You know it?" "I've been there. It's beautiful country, good water, fertile soil in the meadows. but it's also completely isolated. No neighbors for 20 miles in any direction. A woman alone up there. He shook his head. It would be suicide. Nancy felt her heart sink, another dream crumbling to dust in her hands. So I'm trapped. No money to start over somewhere else, and land I can't use. Those men will keep hunting me, and eventually they'll find me. Not necessarily, Gary said slowly, an idea beginning to form in his mind. Bear Creek Valley is good land, but it would take two people to make it work. One person to handle the heavy labor, another to manage the details that keep a homestead running. It would be hard work, dangerous in winter, lonely most of the time. Nancy looked up at him, seeing something new in his gray eyes. A possibility that neither of them had dared to voice. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that maybe we both have something the other needs. You have land, but no skills to work it. I have skills, but no reason to use them for anything beyond simple survival. Together, we might be able to build something worth building. The offer hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm, fraught with risks and complications, but also shining with possibility. Nancy had learned to be suspicious of offers that seemed too good to be true, but there was something in Gary's manner that spoke of genuine sincerity, of a man who'd thought through the implications and was prepared to accept them. You'd leave all this? She asked, gesturing around the cabin that he'd built with his own hands. Your home, your life here. This isn't a life, Gary said quietly. It's just existence, marking time until death comes to claim what grief couldn't finish. Elena would be ashamed of what I've become, hiding up here while the world goes on without me. Maybe it's time I tried to become the man she fell in love with again. Nancy set down her coffee cup, her hands trembling slightly, as the magnitude of what he was proposing began to sink in. It would be a partnership, she said carefully. Nothing more. I won't trade one form of obligation for another. I understand, and I agree. Whatever we build as equals, as partners working toward a common goal. Nothing more, nothing less. The simplicity of the arrangement was both reassuring and terrifying. Nancy had learned not to trust men who claimed to want nothing from her. But Gary's manner suggested a different kind of man, someone whose motivations ran deeper than simple desire or the need for control. Those men will still be looking for me, she said. If we go to Bear Creek Valley, they might follow. I won't put you in danger because of my problems. Gary's smile was grim but determined. Let them come. I know these mountains better than any town-bred thug, and I'm not the same man I was 5 years ago. If Briggs and his men want to collect on your husband's debts, they'll have to go through me first. Outside, the sun was breaking through the clouds, sending shafts of golden light across the snow-covered landscape. Nancy looked out the window at the pristine wilderness, seeing it not as a place of exile, but as a canvas for possibilities she'd never dared to imagine. Bear Creek Valley was 50 miles away, through some of the most challenging terrain in the territory, but it was also a chance at something she'd thought was lost forever, a future built on her own terms. When would we leave, she asked. Spring, the passes will be snowed in until at least April, maybe May. That gives us time to plan, to gather supplies, to prepare for what we're taking on. Gary paused, studying her face. It also gives us time to get to know each other, to make sure this partnership has a chance of working. Nancy nodded, understanding the wisdom in his caution. They were essentially strangers, thrown together by circumstance and desperation, proposing to build a life together in one of the most isolated places on Earth. Trust would have to be earned slowly, carefully, through the small daily interactions that revealed character more clearly than grand gestures ever could. The weeks that followed settled into a routine that felt both strange and comforting to Nancy, who'd grown accustomed to constant uncertainty and fear. Gary proved to be a thoughtful host, respectful of her privacy while ensuring she had everything she needed. He taught her practical skills she'd never learned in her previous life: how to read weather signs, how to preserve meat, how to maintain the tools and equipment that made survival possible in the wilderness. In return, Nancy brought order to the cabin in ways that Gary hadn't realized he'd been missing. She mended his clothes with the skill of a professional seamstress, organized his supplies with an efficiency that impressed him, and filled the long winter evenings with conversation that reminded him how much he'd missed the simple pleasure of sharing thoughts and ideas with another person. They were careful with each other, polite and respectful, but Nancy could feel something growing between them that went beyond mere partnership or convenience. Gary was a good man, she realized, the kind of person her husband had pretended to be but never actually was. He was honest about his limitations, generous with his knowledge, and patient with her mistakes as she learned skills that most mountain women had been raised with. "You're a quick learner," he said one afternoon as she successfully split kindling without embedding the axe in the chopping block. "Most people take months to get the rhythm right." "I've always been good with my hands," Nancy replied, flexing fingers that were growing calloused from the work. "David used to say I could sew a straight seam in a hurricane." "What made you marry him?" Gary asked, the question coming out more direct than he'd intended. Nancy was quiet for a moment, stacking the split wood with careful precision. "Loneliness, I suppose, and the promise of adventure, of a life different from the one I'd been living. I was 26 when we met, old enough to know better but young enough to believe in fairy tales." "Do you regret it?" "I regret the debts, the lies, the way he left me to face the consequences of his choices. But I don't regret the experience, even the painful parts. It taught me things about myself that I might never have learned otherwise." Gary nodded, understanding the complex relationship between regret and growth, between the pain of experience and the wisdom it could bring. "Elena and I met when we were both 19, he said. "We grew up together, learned about life together. Sometimes I wonder if that made losing her harder, because I'd never learned how to be myself without her. And now I'm learning, slowly but learning." As winter deepened, they began to plan in earnest for their journey to Bear Creek Valley. Gary had maps of the territory, hand-drawn sketches that showed not just the major landmarks, but the hidden trails and secret passes that only someone with intimate knowledge of the mountains would know. They planned their route carefully, identifying places where they could rest and resupply, calculating the time it would take to reach their destination with a full load of supplies and equipment. "We'll need pack animals," Gary said one evening as they bent over the maps spread across the kitchen table. "Mules, probably, tough enough to handle the terrain and smart enough not to panic in difficult situations." "How many?" "4, maybe 5. We'll be carrying everything we need to start a homestead from scratch. Tools, seeds, food stores, building supplies. It's a lot of weight, and we can't count on being able to hunt for all our meat." Nancy studied the route he'd marked, seeing the challenges it represented. Mountain passes that might be blocked by snow or rock slides, river crossings that could be treacherous in spring runoff, long stretches of wilderness where a broken axle or injured animal could mean disaster. "It's dangerous," she said. "Yes, but so is staying here. Those men haven't given up. They're just waiting for better weather. Come spring, they'll be back, and they'll bring more men with them." As if summoned by his words, the sound of horses reached them through the cabin's thick walls, the steady rhythm of hoofbeats on snow-packed ground. Gary was on his feet instantly, moving to the window with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to danger. Nancy felt her heart begin to race, the familiar fear flooding back as she recognized the possibility that her past had caught up with her. "3 riders," Gary said quietly, his hand moving to the rifle that hung above the fireplace. "Moving slow, looking for something." Nancy joined him at the window, peering through the frost-etched glass at the figures moving through the trees below. Even at a distance, she recognized the tall, thin silhouette of Briggs, the way he sat his horse with the casual arrogance of a man accustomed to getting his way through intimidation and violence. "They found us," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "No," Gary said firmly. "They're searching, but they don't know we're here. This cabin is well hidden, and the storm covered any tracks you might have left, but they're persistent. I'll give them that." They watched as the 3 men continued their methodical search, checking every potential hiding place, every cave and overhang where someone might seek shelter. Briggs called out occasionally, his voice carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. "Nancy Patel, we know you're up here somewhere. Come out and we can settle this like civilized people. Your husband's debt doesn't have to be your burden." The lies in his voice were obvious to anyone who knew the true nature of what he wanted, but Nancy still felt herself trembling as she listened to him call her name. For weeks, she'd felt safe in Gary's cabin, protected by distance and weather, and the simple kindness of a man who asked nothing from her but honest partnership. Now that safety felt as fragile as morning frost, ready to shatter at the first touch of the sun. "What do we do?" she asked. Gary was quiet for a long moment, watching the men below with the patient attention of a hunter studying his prey. "We wait," he said finally. "They'll search for a while, but they're not equipped for a long stay in these conditions. When the cold starts to bite and they realize they're not going to find you today, they'll head back to town. And then we accelerate our timeline. We leave for Bear Creek Valley as soon as the passes are clear enough to travel, whether we're completely ready or not." The men searched for another hour before the dropping temperature and threatening sky convinced them to abandon their efforts for the day. Nancy and Gary watched them ride away, but both knew this was only a temporary reprieve. Briggs was the kind of man who viewed persistence as a virtue and retreat as merely a tactical adjustment, not a permanent surrender. "He'll be back," Nancy said as the last of the riders disappeared into the trees. "Yes, but not tonight, and probably not tomorrow. Men like that don't like sleeping rough when they have warm beds waiting for them in town." That night, Nancy found sleep elusive, her mind racing with possibilities and fears. She'd grown comfortable in the cabin, had begun to think of it as a refuge where she could heal from the trauma of her husband's death and the chaos that had followed. Now she was forced to confront the reality that safety was always temporary, always conditional, always dependent on factors beyond her control. She rose before dawn and found Gary already awake, sitting by the fire with a cup of coffee and a thoughtful expression that suggested he'd been wrestling with his own concerns through the long night. "I've been thinking," he said without preamble, "about our timeline, about what we're really facing here." Nancy poured herself coffee and settled into the chair across from him, noting the way the firelight carved deep shadows in the lines of his face. "And Briggs isn't going to give up. Men like him see persistence as a matter of professional pride, especially when it comes to collecting debts. He'll keep coming back, bringing more men each time, until he either finds you or convinces himself that you're dead. So we're trapped here until spring." "Not necessarily. There's another option, more dangerous but potentially more effective." Nancy waited, sensing that whatever Gary was about to propose would change everything between them. "We could leave now," he said, "take the winter route to Bear Creek Valley, travel light and fast before Briggs has time to organize a proper search." The idea was so audacious that Nancy almost laughed. "In winter? Through mountain passes in the middle of the worst weather of the year? It's been done, not often and not by many, but it's possible if you know the route and you're prepared for the risks." Nancy stared at him, trying to gauge whether this was desperation talking or genuine confidence in his abilities. "What kind of risks?" "Avalanches, blizzards, temperatures that can kill you in minutes if you're not properly equipped, river crossings over ice that might not hold, passes that might be completely blocked by snow. And if we get injured or lose our supplies, there's no help coming." "You're trying to talk me out of it." "I'm trying to make sure you understand what you'd be agreeing to, because once we start, there's no turning back. We'd be committed to reaching Bear Creek Valley or dying in the attempt." Nancy was quiet for a long moment, weighing the terrible choice he'd laid before her. Stay here and face Briggs and his men, with all the horrors that would entail, or venture into the winter wilderness with a man she'd known for only a few weeks, betting her life on his knowledge and her own untested courage. How long would it take? 3 weeks, maybe 4, depending on conditions. We'd travel fast, carrying only what we absolutely need to survive. No pack animals, no heavy equipment, just the basics and our ability to keep moving no matter what the mountains throw at us. "And you think we can make it?" Gary met her eyes, and she saw in them the same calculation she was making, the same weighing of terrible options against each other. "I think we have a better chance in the mountains than we do against Briggs and whatever men he brings with him next time." Nancy rose and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered landscape that stretched away toward distant peaks. It looked peaceful in the morning light, beautiful and pristine, But she'd learned enough in her time here to recognize the danger hidden beneath that serene surface. The mountains were not malicious, but they were utterly indifferent to human life, as ready to kill the careless as to sustain the prepared. "When would we leave?" she asked. "Tomorrow, if you're willing. I have most of what we'd need, and we can put together the rest today." "But Nancy," he paused, waiting until she turned to face him. "If we do this, we do it together. No second guessing, no turning back, no matter how hard it gets. We succeed together, or we fail together." The weight of his words settled over her like a mantle, heavy with responsibility and possibility. This was more than just an escape plan. It was a commitment to trust him with her life, just as he was trusting her with his. They would be bound together by shared danger and mutual dependence in ways that went far beyond their tentative partnership agreement. "I understand," she said, "and I agree." Gary nodded, something shifting in his expression that spoke of decisions made and bridges burned. "Then we better get started. We have a lot to do and not much time to do it." They spent the day in careful preparation, Gary selecting equipment with the ruthless efficiency of a man who understood that every ounce of weight would have to be carried through some of the most challenging terrain on Earth. Nancy watched him work, noting the way he tested every piece of gear, the careful attention he paid to details that might seem insignificant but could mean the difference between life and death in the wilderness. "This is everything?" she asked, looking at the surprisingly small pile of supplies he'd assembled. "Everything we can afford to carry, food for a month, basic tools, warm clothes, weapons, and medical supplies. It's not much, but it's enough if we're smart and lucky." "And if we're not smart and lucky?" Gary's smile was grim, but not without humor. "Then we'll improvise. It's amazing at what people can survive when they have to." As evening approached, they made their final preparations, going over their route one more time, checking and double-checking their equipment, trying to anticipate the challenges they would face. Nancy felt a strange mixture of terror and excitement building in her chest, the same feeling she imagined explorers must have experienced before setting out into unknown territory. "Are you ready for this?" Gary asked as they prepared for what might be their last night in the cabin. Nancy looked around the room that had been her refuge, her sanctuary, her first taste of safety in months. Tomorrow they would leave it behind, possibly forever, trading its warmth and security for the unknown dangers of the winter wilderness. "No," she said honestly, "but I'm ready to try mine." They left before dawn, slipping out of the cabin like shadows while the world was still locked in the grip of night. Gary had chosen their departure time carefully, knowing that the pre-dawn hours offered the best chance of avoiding detection while still providing enough light to navigate safely through the treacherous terrain that lay ahead. Nancy had never carried such a heavy pack, and within the first mile she understood why Gary had been so ruthless in his selection of supplies. Every step was a struggle, every incline a test of will and endurance that pushed her body to its limits. But she gritted her teeth and kept moving, drawing strength from Gary's steady presence ahead of her and the knowledge that turning back was no longer an option. The first day was a brutal introduction to the realities of winter travel in the high country. The snow was deep and unstable, requiring them to break trail through drifts that sometimes reached their waists. The cold was a living thing, seeping through their clothes and finding every gap in their defenses, turning their breath to ice and making their extremities ache with the constant threat of frostbite. But Gary proved to be everything Nancy had hoped and more. He read the terrain like a book, finding routes that avoided the worst of the obstacles, identifying safe places to rest and shelter when the wind picked up or the snow began to fall. He was patient with her inexperience, encouraging when she faltered, and unfailingly generous with his knowledge and strength. "The key is to keep moving," he said during one of their brief rest stops. "The moment you stop generating heat, the cold starts winning. We can rest when we reach tonight's shelter, but until then, we push forward no matter what." Nancy nodded, too exhausted to speak but determined not to be the weak link in their partnership. She'd made a commitment, given her word, and she would honor it even if it killed her. But as the day wore on and the physical demands of their journey began to take their toll, she started to understand why so few people attempted winter travel in these mountains. Their first night was spent in a cave Gary had scouted years earlier, a natural shelter that provided protection from the wind and a place to build a small fire without the smoke being visible from a distance. Nancy collapsed gratefully onto her sleeping roll, her muscles screaming from the unaccustomed exertion, her feet blistered inside her boots. "How are you holding up?" Gary asked as he prepared their simple meal. "I'm alive," Nancy replied, attempting a smile that probably looked more like a grimace. "That's about all I can manage right now. It gets easier. Your body will adapt, find its rhythm. By the end of the first week, you'll be surprised at what you can do." Nancy hoped he was right, because she wasn't sure she could survive many more days like this one. But as they sat by their small fire, sharing hot food and the simple comfort of human companionship, she felt something stirring inside her that she hadn't experienced in a long time. Pride in her own resilience, satisfaction in meeting a challenge that would have seemed impossible just weeks ago. "Tell me about Bear Creek Valley," she said, needing something to focus on besides her aching body. Gary's expression softened as he described the place that would be their destination. "It's a hidden paradise, tucked away between two mountain ranges where most people would never think to look. Good water, fertile soil, plenty of game, and timber for building. The growing season is short, but if you plan carefully, you can raise enough food to last through the winter." It sounds too good to be true. It's not perfect. The isolation can be overwhelming, especially in winter when you might not see another human being for months at a time. And if something goes wrong, if someone gets hurt or sick, you are completely on your own. Nancy considered this, understanding that he was preparing her for the realities of the life they were choosing. "But you think we can make it work?" "I think we have a better chance than most. You're stronger than you know, and I have the skills we'll need to survive. Together, we might be able to build something worth building." The second day was worse than the first, with a storm moving in that reduced visibility to mere yards and turned the world into a swirling white nightmare. Gary led them through terrain that seemed impossible to navigate, following landmarks that Nancy couldn't even see, trusting to an internal compass that had been calibrated by years of experience in these mountains. They were forced to take shelter in the middle of the day when the storm reached its full fury, huddling together in a makeshift lean-to while the wind howled around them like a living thing. Nancy found herself pressed against Gary's side, sharing body heat in the most practical and necessary way, and was surprised to discover that the contact felt natural, comforting rather than awkward. "Are you warm enough?" he asked, his voice barely audible above the storm. "Yes," she replied, and realized it was true. Despite the terrible conditions, despite the danger and uncertainty of their situation, she felt safer than she had in months. Gary's presence was solid and reassuring, a bulwark against the chaos of the storm and the fears that had driven her into these mountains. When the weather cleared enough for them to continue, they pushed on through snow that was now knee-deep, following a route that seemed to exist only in Gary's memory. Nancy's respect for his abilities grew with each passing hour as he navigated obstacles that would have stopped a less experienced traveler, finding ways through terrain that seemed impassable. "How do you know where we are?" she asked during one of their brief rest stops. Gary pointed to a distinctive rock formation barely visible through the blowing snow. "That's Eagle's Beak, about 12 miles from the cabin. We're making good time, better than I expected given the conditions." Nancy looked at the landmark he'd indicated, trying to see it the way he did, as a signpost in the wilderness rather than just another anonymous pile of stone. She was beginning to understand that survival in these mountains required a completely different way of seeing, ability to read meaning and details that most people would never notice. By the end of their first week, Nancy had begun to find the rhythm Gary had promised. Her body had adapted to the constant demands of travel, her muscles had strengthened, and her endurance had improved dramatically. She was still exhausted at the end of each day, but it was the clean fatigue of honest work rather than the crushing despair she'd felt during their first few days on the trail. More importantly, she was beginning to see herself differently. The woman who had fled into these mountains had been broken by loss and fear, convinced of her own helplessness and dependence on others for survival. But the woman who was emerging from this crucible was someone else entirely, stronger, more confident, more aware of her own capabilities. "You're changing," Gary observed one evening as they sat by their fire in another carefully chosen shelter. "How do you mean?" When I first found you, you moved like someone who expected the world to hurt her. Now you move like someone who's ready to fight back. Nancy considered this, recognizing the truth in his words. I feel different, stronger, I suppose, more like myself than I've felt in years. Who were you before you married David? The question caught her off guard, forcing her to think about a version of herself that seemed to belong to someone else's life. Independent, I suppose. I had my own business, made my own decisions, took care of myself. Marriage changed that, made me smaller somehow. And now? Now I'm remembering who I used to be and discovering who I might become. Gary nodded, understanding the transformation she was describing. He'd seen it in himself as well, the gradual awakening of qualities that had been dormant during his years of self-imposed exile. The man who was leading Nancy through these mountains was not the same broken widower who had fled civilization 5 years ago. Their second week brought new challenges as they climbed higher into the mountains, following passes that tested both their physical endurance and Gary's navigational skills. The air grew thinner, making every step an effort, and the cold became a constant enemy that required vigilance and respect to survive. But they were also beginning to work together as a true team, anticipating each other's needs, sharing the burdens of travel and survival without discussion or negotiation. Nancy had learned to read the signs that Gary watched for, to spot potential hazards and opportunities with something approaching his own expertise. You're becoming a mountain woman, he said one morning, as she efficiently broke camp and prepared for the day's journey. Is that what I am? It's what you're becoming. The question is whether you like what you see. Nancy considered this as they began another day's march through terrain that would have terrified her just weeks ago. She thought about the woman she'd been in her previous life, comfortable and safe, but also constrained by expectations and limitations that had never been her own choice. That woman would never have survived what she'd endured, would never have found the strength to keep going when everything seemed hopeless. I like it, she said finally. I like who I'm becoming. Their third week brought them to the high passes, where the air was so thin that every breath was an effort and the cold was sharp enough to kill in minutes. This was the most dangerous part of their journey, where a single mistake could trigger an avalanche or send them plummeting into crevasses hidden beneath innocent-looking snow. Gary's experience and judgment were tested to their limits as he led them through terrain that seemed designed to kill unwary travelers. Nancy followed in his footsteps, trusting his choices even when they seemed to lead towards certain disaster, and was rewarded with safe passage through obstacles that would have stopped them permanently. How much further? She asked one evening as they sheltered in a wind-carved hollow barely large enough for their bodies. 3 days, maybe 4, depending on conditions. The worst is behind us now. Nancy felt a mixture of relief and something that might have been disappointment. The journey had been the hardest thing she'd ever done, but it had also been transformative in ways she was still discovering. The thought of reaching their destination, of trading the constant challenge of travel for the different challenges of building a homestead, brought with it a sense of completion, but also loss. What happens when we get there? She asked. Gary was quiet for a long moment, staring into their small fire. We build something, he said finally. A home, a life, a partnership that works for both of us. We prove that 2 broken people can create something whole. And if we can't, then we'll have tried. That's more than either of us was doing before. Nancy nodded, understanding that he was offering her something precious and fragile. Hope. Not the desperate hope of someone with no other options, but the mature hope of people who had seen the worst the world could offer and chosen to believe in the possibility of something better. On their 19th day, they crested the final pass and looked down into Bear Creek Valley for the first time. Nancy caught her breath at the sight spread before them, a hidden paradise of meadows and forest, protected by towering peaks and watered by streams that caught the morning light like scattered diamonds. It's beautiful, she whispered. It's home, Gary replied, and Nancy heard in his voice the same wonder she felt in her own heart. They descended into the valley as the sun reached its zenith, their long journey finally nearing its end. Nancy felt tears freezing on her cheeks as she realized what they had accomplished. How far they had come, not just in miles, but in transformation of spirit and purpose. Bear Creek Valley exceeded even Gary's descriptions, a hidden Eden tucked away in the heart of the mountains, where winter's grip was gentler and the promise of spring seemed more certain. They made camp that first night beside the creek that gave the valley its name, and Nancy fell asleep to the sound of running water instead of howling wind for the first time in weeks. "We did it," she said the next morning, the words carrying a weight of disbelief and triumph that made Gary smile. "We did, and now the real work begins." The valley offered everything Gary had promised: timber for building, water for drinking and irrigation, meadows that would support crops and livestock, and game trails that spoke of abundant hunting. But it also presented challenges that would test every skill they'd developed during their harrowing journey. They spent their first week exploring the valley, identifying the best locations for their homestead, mapping resources and potential hazards, beginning to understand the rhythms and patterns of their new home. Gary's knowledge of construction and Nancy's eye for practical details combined to create plans for a settlement that would be both functional and sustainable. "We'll build a cabin here," Gary said, indicating a slight rise that would provide good drainage while remaining protected from the worst of the winter winds. Close enough to the creek for easy water access, but high enough to avoid flooding during spring runoff. Nancy studied the site, visualizing the home they would build together. It would be larger than Gary's mountain cabin, designed for two people who were partners rather than host and guest. The thought of creating something permanent, something that belonged to both of them, filled her with excitement and anticipation. They worked from dawn to dusk, falling into a routine that felt both natural and productive. Gary handled the heavy construction work, felling trees and shaping logs with the skill of a master craftsman. Nancy focused on the details that would make their house a home, planning the interior layout, organizing their supplies, preparing meals that sustained them through long days of physical labor. But as they worked, they also talked, sharing stories and dreams and fears in a way that gradually built the foundation of genuine partnership. Nancy learned about Gary's childhood in Texas, his apprenticeship as a carpenter, his courtship of Elena, and the dreams they'd shared before fever claimed her life. Gary learned about Nancy's struggles as a young woman trying to make her way alone in the world, her brief happiness with David, and the strength she'd discovered in herself during their mountain journey. "I never thought I could do this," Nancy said one evening as they sat by their fire, exhausted but satisfied with the day's progress. "Do what?" "Any of it. Build a home in the wilderness, survive on my own skills, be a true partner to someone instead of just a burden." Gary looked at her across the flames, seeing the woman she'd become during their weeks together. The frightened, desperate creature he'd found in the mountains had been transformed into someone confident and capable. Someone who met challenges head-on instead of running from them. "You were never a burden," he said. "From the first day, you've pulled your weight and more. Elena would have liked you." The comment brought tears to Nancy's eyes, not from sadness, but from the recognition of what he was offering her, acceptance into the most sacred part of his heart, acknowledgement that she belonged in the life he was building. Their cabin took shape slowly but steadily, rising from the valley floor like something that had always belonged there. Gary's craftsmanship was evident in every joint and beam, but Nancy's influence was equally present in the thoughtful details that would make their home comfortable and efficient. As spring advanced and the weather grew warmer, they expanded their efforts beyond simple shelter. Nancy planted a garden using seeds they'd carried from Gary's mountain cabin, while Gary built corrals and outbuildings that would support livestock when they could afford to purchase animals. "It's starting to look like a real homestead," Nancy observed one morning as she surveyed their growing settlement. "It's starting to feel like one too," Gary replied, and Nancy heard in his voice something she'd never expected: contentment. But their peace was not destined to last undisturbed. On a warm afternoon in late spring, as Nancy worked in her garden and Gary repaired a section of roof damaged by the previous night's storm, the sound of approaching horses reached them across the valley. Nancy's blood turned to ice as she recognized the familiar rhythm of hoofbeats, the casual arrogance with which the riders approached their hidden sanctuary. She dropped her gardening tools and ran toward the cabin, where Gary was already reaching for his rifle. How did they find us? She asked, her voice tight with the fear she'd thought was behind her forever. I don't know, Gary replied, his jaw set with grim determination. But it doesn't matter. This is our home now, and they're not taking you anywhere. Three riders emerged from the tree line at the valley's entrance, and Nancy's worst fears were confirmed as she recognized Briggs's tall, thin silhouette. He had brought reinforcements this time, two hard-faced men who rode with the easy confidence of professional gunmen. Nancy Patel, Briggs called out as they approached, his voice carrying clearly across the meadow. We've come a long way to find you. Time to settle your husband's debts. Gary stepped out of the cabin, his rifle held ready but not yet aimed, his presence a clear statement of protection and defiance. This is private property, he called back. You're not welcome here. Briggs laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Private property? According to who? This is open territory, Mountain Man, and we have legal papers that say Nancy Patel owes us money. Legal papers that were signed by her husband, not by her, Gary replied. She's not responsible for his debts. The law says otherwise. A wife is responsible for her husband's obligations, especially when those obligations were incurred for her benefit. Nancy stepped out of the cabin to stand beside Gary, her fear transformed into anger at the lies Briggs was telling. David's debts were gambling debts, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the distance between them, money he borrowed and lost trying to get rich quick. I never saw a penny of it, and I won't pay for his mistakes. You'll pay one way or another, Briggs replied, his pale eyes glittering with malice. $500 or we'll take payment in trade. Gary stepped slightly in front of Nancy, his rifle now raised to a more threatening position. The lady has made her position clear. I suggest you respect it and ride out of here while you still can. Briggs studied Gary with the calculating gaze of a predator sizing up potential prey. And who might you be, Mountain Man? Her new protector? Her business partner? Or just another mark she's running games on? I'm the man who's telling you to leave, Gary replied, his voice steady despite the tension that radiated from his posture. This valley is our home, and you're not welcome here. Your home? Briggs laughed again, but there was less humor in it this time. You got papers for this land? Legal documents that say you own it? Because if you don't, then you're just squatters, and squatters don't have rights. Nancy felt her heart sink as she realized the truth in Briggs's words. They'd been so focused on reaching the valley, on building their homestead and creating a life together, that they'd never properly filed the legal claims that would establish their ownership of the land. In the eyes of the law, they were indeed just squatters, with no more right to be here than Briggs and his men. But Gary seemed unperturbed by this legal technicality. Papers don't mean much out here, he said. What matters is who's willing to fight for what they claim, and who's smart enough to know when they're outmatched. Outmatched? One of Briggs's companions, a stocky man with cruel eyes and scarred hands, laughed harshly. 3 armed men against one mountain hermit and a woman? I like those odds. Do you? Gary's smile was cold as winter wind. Then you don't know these mountains very well. This valley has only one way in and one way out, and you're looking at the man who knows every rock, every tree, every hiding place within 50 miles. You might take us in a straight fight, but you'll never make it out alive. Nancy felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air as she realized what Gary was proposing. He was willing to turn their hidden paradise into a battlefield, to risk everything they'd built rather than surrender to Briggs's demands. The thought terrified her, but it also filled her with a fierce pride in the man who stood beside her own. Briggs seemed to sense the shift in the situation, the way the balance of power had subtly changed despite his numerical advantage. You're bluffing, Mountain Man. No one's that good, and no woman's worth dying for. Elena was, Gary said quietly, and Nancy heard in those 2 words a depth of commitment that took her breath away. He wasn't just protecting her, he was honoring the memory of his first wife by refusing to let another woman be victimized while he had the power to prevent it. Elena? Briggs's eyes narrowed with sudden interest. Who's Elena? Another woman you've got stashed up here? Elena was my wife, Gary replied. She died 5 years ago, and I've been alone ever since, until now. The implication in his words was clear, and Nancy felt her cheeks flush as she realized what he was claiming. To Briggs and his men, they weren't just partners or friends. They were a couple bound together by ties that went deeper than mere convenience or mutual benefit. Well, isn't that romantic? Briggs sneered. The grieving widower and the desperate widow, finding comfort in each other's arms. But sentiment doesn't pay debts, and Nancy Patel still owes me $500. Then you'll have to collect it from someone else, Nancy said, finding her voice and her courage. Because I'm not going anywhere with you, and I'm not paying for debts that were never mine to begin with. Briggs's expression hardened, the mask of civilized discourse finally slipping to reveal the predator underneath. Have it your way then. Boys, it looks like we're going to have to do this the hard way. The two gunmen began to spread out, moving to flank the cabin and eliminate Gary's defensive advantage. Nancy felt her heart racing as she realized that their confrontation was about to turn violent, that the peaceful life they'd been building was about to be shattered by the same forces that had driven her into the mountains in the first place. But Gary had not survived 5 years alone in the wilderness by being unprepared for danger. As the gunman moved to outflank him, he whistled sharply, a sound that seemed to echo strangely in the valley air. Within moments, Nancy heard answering calls from the surrounding forest, the voices of men who had been waiting in concealment for just such a signal. What the hell? Briggs spun in his saddle, trying to locate the source of the sounds that seemed to come from every direction at once. I told you I knew these mountains, Gary said, his rifle now trained directly on Briggs's chest. What I didn't mention was that I'm not the only one who calls this territory home. The Ute tribe has hunting grounds in these valleys, and they don't take kindly to strangers who threaten their friends. As if summoned by his words, a dozen Native American warriors emerged from the forest, their faces painted for war, their weapons ready for battle. They moved with the fluid grace of men who belonged in this landscape, who knew every advantage it offered and how to use them. Briggs's face went pale as he realized how completely he'd been outmaneuvered. His two gunmen looked nervously at the warriors surrounding them, their earlier confidence evaporating in the face of overwhelming odds. This isn't over, Briggs said, his voice tight with frustrated rage. The law is on my side, and I'll be back with federal marshals and legal papers that even your Indian friends won't be able to ignore. Maybe, Gary replied, but that will take time, and a lot can happen in these mountains before federal marshals arrive. Men get lost, have accidents, disappear without a trace. It's a dangerous place for people who don't belong here. The threat was implicit but unmistakable, and Briggs seemed to understand that he'd pushed as far as he could without crossing a line that would have permanent consequences. With visible reluctance, he signaled to his men to withdraw, but his pale eyes promised that this confrontation was far from over. This isn't finished, Nancy Patel, he called out as they rode away. You can hide in these mountains for now, but eventually you'll have to come back to civilization. And when you do, I'll be waiting. Nancy watched them disappear into the forest, her body shaking with reaction to the confrontation and its implications. They'd won this round, but at what point? Briggs would return, probably with more men and legal authority that even Gary's mountain allies couldn't challenge. Thank you, she said to the Ute warriors who had come to their aid. I don't know how to repay you for what you've done. The leader of the warriors, a man with graying hair and intelligent eyes, stepped forward. Gary Ortiz is friend to our people, he said in careful English. He has shared knowledge, traded fairly, shown respect for our ways. His enemies are our enemies. Gary clasped the warrior's hand in a gesture of mutual respect and gratitude. This is Nancy, he said. She's my partner, He paused, searching for the right words. Wife, Nancy said quietly, the words surprising her as much as it seemed to surprise Gary. But as soon as she spoke it, she knew it was true, not in any legal sense, but in the deeper ways that mattered. They'd been forged into something more than partners by their shared trials, their mutual dependence, their growing trust and affection. The Ute warriors departed as silently as they had appeared, but their intervention had bought Gary and Nancy precious time to consider their options. As evening fell over the valley, they sat by their fire and discussed the realities of their situation with the hard-won wisdom of people who'd learned not to deceive themselves about the challenges they faced. Briggs will be back, Nancy said, stating the obvious truth they both understood, and next time he'll bring federal marshals, legal papers, maybe even territorial officials who won't be impressed by our Ute allies. Gary nodded, poking at the fire with a stick as he considered their limited options. He's right about one thing. We don't have legal title to this land. We're squatters, and squatters' rights won't protect us against federal authority. So what do we do? Run again? Find another valley, another hiding place? We could. These mountains are full of places where people could disappear if they wanted to badly enough. But is that the life you want? Always running, always looking over your shoulder, never able to build anything permanent? Nancy was quiet for a long moment, thinking about the question he'd posed. The life they'd built in Bear Creek Valley was everything she'd dreamed of. Independence, partnership, the satisfaction of creating something meaningful with her own hands. The thought of abandoning it, of returning to the rootless existence of fugitives, filled her with despair. There might be another option, Gary said slowly, his voice carrying the weight of an idea that was still forming in his mind. What kind of option? Marriage. Real marriage, legal and binding, witnessed and recorded. If you're my wife, legally and officially, then your husband's debts become a matter between him and me, not him and you. And as my wife, you'd have legal standing to file homestead claims, to establish ownership of this land. Nancy stared at him across the fire, trying to process the implications of what he was proposing. You'd marry me to protect me from Briggs? I'd marry you because I love you, Gary said quietly, the words hanging in the air between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. I've been falling in love with you since that first night in my cabin, watching you find your strength, your courage, your true self. The protection from Briggs would just be a practical benefit. Nancy felt tears stinging her eyes as she realized what he was offering her. Not just legal protection or practical partnership, but genuine love from a man who'd seen her at her worst and chosen to believe in her best. I love you too, she whispered. I think I have for weeks, but I was afraid to admit it, afraid to hope for something that seemed too good to be true. Gary rose and moved around the fire to sit beside her, taking her hands in his work-roughened fingers. Nothing about this is too good to be true. We've earned this, both of us, through everything we've survived and overcome. We've proven that we can face anything together. When? Nancy asked, already knowing that she would say yes to whatever he proposed. Tomorrow. We'll ride to the territorial capital, find a judge or minister, make it legal and binding. Then we'll file homestead claims on this valley, establish our rights under federal law. By the time Briggs comes back with his marshals and legal papers, he'll find that Nancy Patel no longer exists. There'll only be Nancy Ortiz, legally married woman and property owner, with rights that even federal authority will have to respect. Nancy laughed through her tears, amazed at the elegant simplicity of his solution. You think it will work? I think it's our best chance. And even if it doesn't work perfectly, at least we'll face whatever comes next as husband and wife, legally bound together in the eyes of the law and God. They were married 3 days later in the territorial capital, in a simple ceremony performed by a circuit judge who asked no awkward questions about their past or their reasons for seeking such a hasty union. Nancy wore her best dress, carefully preserved through their mountain journey, and Gary wore a suit he'd purchased for the occasion, transforming himself from mountain man to respectable citizen with remarkable ease. The homestead claims were filed the same day, establishing their legal ownership of Bear Creek Valley under the federal laws that govern territorial settlement. Nancy signed the papers as Nancy Ortiz, feeling the weight of her new identity and the protection it offered. They returned to their valley as husband and wife, legally bound and officially protected, ready to face whatever challenges the future might bring. Their cabin felt different now, not just a shelter they'd built together, but a true home, sanctified by love and legitimized by law. Briggs returned 6 weeks later, accompanied by a federal marshal and armed with legal documents demanding Nancy Patel's surrender to face charges related to her husband's debts. But Nancy Patel no longer existed, and Nancy Ortiz was a legally married woman whose husband had assumed responsibility for any premarital obligations. This is fraud, Briggs raged when the marshal explained the legal situation. She changed her name to avoid her debts. She changed her name because she got married, the marshal replied wearily. which is what women do, last I checked. And her husband has assumed legal responsibility for any premarital debts, which means your dispute is with him, not her. Gary stepped forward, his manner calm but his eyes hard as winter ice. I've reviewed the documents you claim establish these debts, he said. Gambling markers signed by David Patel, witnessed by your employees, with terms that violate territorial usury laws. Even if these debts were legitimate, which they're not, the maximum legal interest rate would make the actual amount owed about $50, not $500. Briggs's face flushed with rage as he realized how completely his scheme had been dismantled. You can't prove those witnesses work for me. Actually, I can, Gary replied, producing a folder of documents. Public records, employment records, witness statements from other miners who saw your men pressuring David Patel into signing those markers. You've been running a loan shark operation, Mr. Briggs, and the territorial authorities are very interested in discussing your business practices. The marshal studied the documents Gary had provided, his expression growing increasingly grim as he read. Mr. Briggs, he said finally, I think you'd better come with me. We have some questions about your lending practices, and there are several complaints that need to be investigated. Nancy watched from the porch of their cabin as Briggs was led away in handcuffs, his scheme finally exposed and his power over her life permanently broken. The man who had terrorized her, who had driven her into the mountains in fear for her life, was revealed as nothing more than a common criminal whose authority had been built on intimidation and illegal practices. It's over, Gary said, joining her on the porch as the marshal and his prisoner disappeared into the forest. Is it really? Nancy asked, hardly daring to believe that the nightmare that had begun with her husband's death was finally ended. Really, Briggs will be lucky to avoid prison, and even if he gets out eventually, he'll have no legal claim on you or anything you own. You're free, Nancy. We're free. Nancy leaned against her husband's solid presence, feeling the weight of fear and uncertainty finally lifting from her shoulders. They'd built something beautiful in Bear Creek Valley, something that belonged to them completely and couldn't be taken away by the greed or malice of others. As autumn painted the valley in shades of gold and crimson, Nancy reflected on the journey that had brought her to this place of peace and contentment. She'd entered these mountains as a broken woman with nothing, running from a past that seemed determined to destroy her. She was leaving that identity behind as a woman who'd found her strength, her purpose, and her true partner in life. I love you, she said to Gary as they watched the sun set over their valley, painting the peaks in shades of rose and purple. I love you too, he replied, his arm tightening around her waist. And I love the life we've built together, the home we've created, the future we're going to share. Nancy smiled, thinking of all the tomorrows stretching ahead of them, full of possibilities they would explore together. She'd learned that love wasn't just about romance or passion, though those things had their place. Real love was about partnership, about choosing to face life's challenges together, about building something meaningful that was stronger than either person could create alone. The mountains around them stood eternal and unchanging, witnesses to the transformation that had taken place in their hidden valley. Two broken people had found each other in the wilderness and discovered that their combined strength was greater than the sum of their individual parts. They'd created not just a home, but a legacy, proof that even in the harshest circumstances, love could flourish and hope could triumph over despair. As the stars emerged in the darkening sky, Nancy and Gary went inside their cabin, ready to face whatever the future might bring, secure in the knowledge that they would face it together, as partners, as lovers, as husband and wife. The woman with nothing had found everything she'd ever needed in the arms of a man who'd thought he'd lost everything. And together they'd built a life worth living in the heart of the untamed wilderness they now called home.